dopamine swipe. Dopamine swipe. Followers, likes, double tap. Now they control your life.
What's going on, beautiful people? Welcome back to the 817 podcast, where we talk about the lovely city of Fort Worth, Texas. We hit topics such as business, politics, culture, you name it. And for this month, we have been having guest co-hosts because our lovely gentleman, Jimmy Sweeney, is departing from the podcast in the city of Fort Worth, Texas. I wonder how that's going for him. We will hear back from him in June. We will not have a pod next week because I will be out of town. So this is our last guest co-host pod, and I've been really excited about this one. Today we have Nydia Cardenas and D. Laura O'Neill. What's up, beautiful people?
Hey.
So, Nydia, so what's cool about D and Nydia, they're both true Fort Worthians. One of the things I'm jealous of, because I'm just a newbie. But Nydia, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, what's your Fort Worth story, and like what you're working on today?
Sure. My Fort Worth story is born and raised here in Fort Worth. It's a product of Fort Worth ISD. Shout out to Worth Heights, Morningside, Northside, and the school bus, because I used to ride the bus to school. But yeah, so I grew up here. Actually, when I spent a lot of time away, though. So I left for college and then work and grad school. So I was gone for a while and actually just moved back in 2020. At the time, it was a short-term pandemic move. I was living in LA and my lease was up, so I put my stuff in a storage unit and was like, oh, go to Texas, ride this pandemic out with the family. And then I got to Fort Worth and I was like, wow, Fort Worth is a different place than 18 years ago. And so I decided to kind of explore what was going on. I was really excited to see the changes and how the city's grown. And I feel like it's such an interesting point in the city's evolution that it's like too interesting to leave, you know? And so here I am. Yeah.
Love it. And I can't believe you two don't know each other because, D, you also grew up here. What's your Fort Worth story?
Yes, I grew up here. So my Fort Worth story started with my great-grandfather, who used to come to Fort Worth to work in the Bracero program. So they worked for the meatpacking plant and they worked on the railroad. And my grandpa loved it so much, he moved the family out here. And then after I was born, my mom followed. We lived in Mexico City until I was about 6 or 7. And then finally moved back to Fort Worth. We lived on the east side, went to parochial schools, Nolan Catholic, went to college here, University of Dallas, and Texas Women's for my nursing degree. And I really love it. I think when I was younger, I couldn't wait to get out. And then we got out for a little bit, right? We traveled in Europe and this, that, and the other. And the more time I spent away from here, I realized like, oh, the city has everything I love. And I want to stay here and make it the best city I can make it.
Yeah. And D, you're also like an artist. I know our relationship is pretty new, but tell me more about like your artist background.
Yep.
And involvement in that part.
So some of your listeners might be familiar with Art Tooth. So that was an art collective that myself and a few of my colleagues started to advocate for Fort Worth arts. I worked as a social practice artist and I did a little bit of writing for the Fort Worth Weekly. And it was really great to organize the artist community. They're near and dear to me. I identify still as an artist. I think everyone is an artist, to be honest, or a cultural producer is what I like to call it, like EJ, right? And that those are valuable voices to have in a diverse community, and I'm always happy to advocate for them.
I felt honored I got invited to the Cool Artists Party for being a podcaster.
How do I get on that invite?
I know. I'm surprised.
What culture do I need to produce?
And Nydia, I know you do a lot. Like you said, you went to college, but you went to Stanford and all that jazz, and you have the impact background. I would love for you to stay in Fort Worth, but I also know your talents could be bigger than us. So I'm glad we have you on the podcast. How are you looking at like the world in your lens as maybe social impact or as executive coach or kind of that space? What would you kind of see your imprint has been in Fort Worth, or what are your projects you're working on now that maybe will make an impact in Fort Worth?
Yeah, so the work, I studied engineering in college, but I never worked as an engineer. I went into sort of the nonprofit space and the social impact sector. And right now, the work that I do, a lot of it is focused on, so I'm a coach, but I created this thing called the Energy Take Back. And so my whole thing is that if we want to create a better world for all of us, like we need to have our best energy for it and not show up to it drained and burnt out. But often a lot of people that are doing the groundwork and, organizing and trying to create change are often doing it at the expense of themselves and their well-being because it's, they're just so committed to the work. But I feel like we can create a different paradigm around that work and help people be resourced and have the best energy that they can. So that's the focus of my sort of my own energy now, is in doing that and helping people explore the agency they have over their energy and like what does that look like, knowing that we also live, a lot of the energy drain comes from like the context that we live in, but I think we have a lot more agency than we often exercise. And so I'm hoping to actually work on something later this year, specifically with people in Fort Worth who are doing that groundwork, whether they're elected or artists or and kind of create a cohort and take them through this experience here locally and like see what happens as their energy shifts. So that's something I'm working on right now.
So Nidia, as you were talking, like I went, because that art party that I invited EJ to was bringing together cultural producers and community organizers to talk about capacity building, because it really seems at the grassroots level, especially in Fort Worth, we see so many people, just visionaries, burn out. And there's not a lot of avenues at the grassroots level for mentoring. So that's really amazing. And I'll send you the notes, and it would be awesome to get together.
I would love that. Yeah. So
look at 817
we'll be having
podcast.
more combos
Look
about
at this.
this.
And, I would love that conversation to keep going, but we would be here for 2 hours. And we do have some committed listeners, but I want to make sure we get to time. So talk about energy sucks. We are going to talk about Tarrant County Judge Tim O'Hare. Nidia, you said you're going to lead this short story for us. What do we have?
All right. So the story we should all be terrified about. Congressman, others urge feds to investigate Tarrant County judge over voting rights. The terrifying part is the county judge, not the fact that this letter was written. This is actually a good thing. And I think, one thing I want to say is like in 2020, I spent like 50 hours in the election office when the county experienced that challenge with the external printer, the third-party printer they hired, and the ballots weren't being read properly. And I saw people from both parties sitting diligently duplicating all of these ballots that people had mailed in, that members of the ballot board. And I just saw all these checks and balances. And yes, it's a slow process, but that's a good thing. And so I just felt like I developed a lot of more trust in the process, because I spent so many hours there, like in the weeds. And if anybody knows me, I always ask a million questions. And Hyder and the Democratic and the overseer of everything, like they answered all my questions. Like, I mean, I had a lot of questions. And so to me, this is the most concerning thing, like the fact that we have a county judge who, is constantly trying to sell that there were things that were being like voter fraud and all this kind of stuff, which there was an investigation and, nothing really resulted from that. And so I'm just worried at the level of, when I saw that Hyder resigned, and listen, speaking of burnout, I think he was put through so much crap in the last few years that like, I could understand his decision to do that and to like reach the limit of, now you're asking me to compromise my values. I can't go that far. Right. And so to me, this is really scary, because I think we all need to be paying attention to this. Voting is such an important lever for us, even though it's underutilized. Everybody go vote. I know everybody listens to the podcast is a voter. I know that. But yeah, this was one of the short stories I just felt like we had to get into, because it's the scariest thing to me.
And the letter was signed by Democratic U.S. Rep. Mark Vesey and 6 others, including Nicole.
Ramon Romero, Chris Turner, Nicole Collier, and then the commissioners, Lisa Simmons, Roy Brooks, and then Salman Bojani. Yeah.
And they asked the Justice Department to review the actions and give them a written response about the Civil Rights Division, because they're nervous about voter intimidation and harassment in Tarrant County. One of our pods, when we were with Ann, me and Jimmy Zeta, we were talking about the situation of how they find the next Hyder Garcia. It's between 5 people: the chair of the Democratic Party, the chair of the Republican, the chair of the Libertarian, and then like 2 other people, which includes Tim O'Hare and someone else. But based off of the 5's political narrative, 2 are alt-heavy GOP. 1 is like maybe sensical Republican. Then you have the Libertarian, and then you have Allison Campolo, the Tarrant Democrat County person, who also seems frightened and concerned about this, as she has a text and an updated story that shared. She said in a text response that I don't know if you also saw this, that the GOP is looking at paper ballots. And I guess this just dropped. We're recording on Friday, so this just happened Thursday night. But Tarrant GOP's executive committee passed a resolution Thursday evening asking local party leaders and Tarrant County commissioners to authorize local and statewide voting systems that would allow paper ballots and end the countywide voting system. And so that is what Ms. Campolo was responding to. But her whole take was on, they're trying to move the precinct voting. She said, quote, paper ballots and precinct only voting do not make the voting process safer and would significantly enhance the time it takes to count ballots, in addition to reducing the number of people who can vote and the clarity of their choices once they do vote, end quote, Ms. Campolo said. So, update to the story. Like you said, there was Tim O'Hare in the Mark Vesey letter. Now you have, I guess, the Tarrant County GOP double clicking and saying, we're going even further. We want to go back to paper, pre-internet. And now people are frightened because these are the same people who are also going to pick the next Hyder Garcia. Dee, what's your take?
It's really terrifying. It's really alarming. Like, we know what kind of record Tim O'Hare has, right? He put out a statement too, right, EJ, like after the letter was sent, where he was essentially saying that this was just a partisan hack job, the letter was. And it's like, I mean, I'm pretty sure, I think in the tweet he was using like us versus them terminology. So like automatically it's partisan. And by all accounts, Hyder Garcia has been kind of a paragon of like running a good election. So I don't think it bodes well for who they select next or what that process will look like. And it's really unfortunate. There's so much abuse that can happen in places where people aren't paying attention because voter turnout is so low. And I think it's very obscure, I think, to the average person what the county is responsible for versus like your city government versus your state government. I think it's just kind of ripe for abuse.
I agree. The fact that they want to go back to paper ballots, and I think the move towards people being able to vote anywhere in the county, like actually gets more people to vote. Like honestly, I work the polls on election day, and I see people. They're like, "Oh, I work down the street. If I had to get back home after work at 5 o'clock, traffic we all know is getting worse and worse in Fort Worth because we just believe in building roads and not public transit." And it's like, how are people? You're just making it harder. Why? Yeah. Because you want fewer people to vote.
Right. And the fact that you want fewer people to vote when so few already vote, to me, is like, that sounds nefarious.
Yeah, you only want one kind of voter. Yeah.
And Tim O'Hare was on Mark Davis' show, which is a radio show, which I didn't know people still get on radio shows. But it says voting rights haven't been suppressed, is what Tim O'Hare said. He also said there's no pattern of harassment. And he said, quote, that it's so dumb, it's not even worthy of response. So... we will see how this continues to go, but I agree with both of you. This is, to me, what are you most afraid of in Tarrant County? It's Tim O'Hare leading our elections and deciding who our next Hyder Garcia is. So that is a bow on that story. Let's go ahead and move into a second story, which we're going to go ahead and move into District 11. All right, so as you know, the other two new districts have been sworn into City Council. And so we are only waiting on District 11 to see who is going to be in addition to City Council. And I wouldn't mean new district. We're talking about Macy Hill, who took Firestone as well. And then the new District 4 individual because Blaylock moved to 10. And so District 11 is up for a runoff, and the third person, Tara Maldonado Wilson, who got 18% of the votes, just on Friday morning, so today for us, posted a endorsement for Rick Herring, which was the person in second. And so to give you concept there, he was in second by roughly 60 votes. So you're looking at something that could really move it when the third person got 18% of the votes. And so we also feel like this is a conversation because in the weeds of all this, it's a lot of political jargon. Rick Herring is a Republican and Tara Maldonado is a progressive. And the Democrat person is Jeanette Martinez. And so you would have thought that kind of like Tara would have endorsed the Democrat and now she endorsed a Republican. So I just think what it does is shows the nuances and challenges of the political scene in Fort Worth and how the waters could get muddy. So I'm going to just kind of stop talking and send it over to you two. I'm going to go over to D. D, you felt like this was called for us to talk about this story today. And what to you, as someone who's not a District 11 voter, but why is this important to you seeing this story being talked about?
Well, first I want to add or say, what's that saying, like, local politics makes for strange bedfellows? Because Tara came out this morning and gave not just like an endorsement, a ringing endorsement. She said, I unequivocally, unapologetically, and full-heartedly put my support behind Rick. Like, no mincing of words.
Yep.
And, District 11 was created to be an opportunity district specifically for Latino voters. We know what Latino representation looks like on city council. It's really just Carlos Flores. So it could really change the face of leadership in the city. And I think that it's interesting that Tara is a progressive endorsing a Republican, that Jeanette is running as an established Democrat, but who has POA backing. And it seems like that was a clear deal breaker for Tara. I think it's unclear, or I haven't heard anything from Rick about what his position is on the POA. And I think most importantly, the CCPD money, which we know uses a lot of financial resources in the city. And the other thing that I'd note about Tara's comment is that, it was a clapback. There are things on here that aren't like your typical Fort Worth way communications. She didn't do a lot of the niceties. And to some extent, that kind of honesty is just refreshing.
100%. Yeah. So to kind of dive into this, as Nidhi, I know you and I are District 11 voters here. So, and we are all very close to the conversation, right? We all have somehow connections as friends, as donors, as supporters of all candidates, being discussed in some capacity. They've been on the podcast, so that's also a big thing that I always try to respect. How are you navigating it, the District 11, and how do you see the situation?
I should start by being transparent about the fact that I have that I know both Tara and Jeanette and have a personal relationship with them. So I want to make sure that I say that up front, because also I think then therefore my lens is both like personal and also messaging and the marketing of the campaigns, right? So like I would see those things, and then also I've had personal conversations with them, and I think what I agree with Dee what you said, that it was very much not like your polite statement, right? And so I respect Tara for being really clear about what she, who she's supporting. I perhaps would have wanted to see something more like, hey, this is what I think are the pros and cons of each of these candidates from my experience with them and from a policy perspective, from the role of city council, and then said to the voters, like, hey, thank you for coming out to vote for me. We need to vote again, right? We need to vote in this runoff. Don't stay home just because, I didn't win. And I think that could have been an interesting approach to take in this moment. But I'm also not Tara, and I haven't had all these conversations. I know she met with each of them, individually to make this decision, and I know that she's a very thoughtful person. So I know she didn't make it lightly. But I'm not gonna say I wasn't like surprised, but then I had to catch myself and sort of being like, oh, a Latina should endorse a Latina because that's a Latino opportunity district, and we also know that not all people of color are always like the advocates for our community, right? And so, yeah. And then I think for Jeanette, I feel like where a missed opportunity that she's had is that it doesn't feel like she's communicated her values or like the kind of things that I know her to believe in. I don't feel like that's been the messaging that she's used. Like she's kind of focused on other things that and I mean, when people campaign for stuff, everything's always like intentionally vague and ambiguous, right? But I feel like I would have wanted to hear her voice come more clearly through in this process, and I didn't see that in the debates or in her mailings and stuff. So yeah, I mean, I think it's I'm excited that there's there were 5 people running, for
Yeah,
city
yeah.
council. Like, that's great.
Yeah, no. So I'm gonna just quote the part that I thought was like the clappiest of claps. It was instead we got a candidate propped up by special interests who is unable to articulate why they are in the race, had to be convinced to run in the first place, and who now lacks a fundamental understanding of what is necessary to serve on city council. Jeanette Martinez has glaring conflicts of interest when it comes to her paid position at the county, and has made clear through her actions her intentions to keep things as business as usual, the Fort Worth way, which is not what District 11 needs. So kind of for like the average listener who maybe just kind of caught on, who you're not District 11, Rick kind of came out early with a lot of signs to be kind of the lead into that situation. And I do know that like Tara also was out in the lead. And then I also know Jeanette was going back and forth. And there was like even like a quick, I think Christina Galvin kind of.
Crystal Galvin.
Crystal Galvin. Yes. And then that stopped and she endorsed Jeanette. So there was a lot there. And then the challenge here is like going, Rick is a Republican. So then like it was easy for progressive, like, oh, we're not voting for Rick. And then Jeanette took the POA endorsement, which usually goes to a Republican candidate. So then that washed kind of like, oh, we're going to vote for Jeanette. And then Jeanette started getting endorsements from Betsy Price, and it just started getting even weirder. And so what I'm always a fan of Tara Wilson, because like the 817 podcast, I think we are alt genre outside of the establishment, but not afraid to be ourselves and show that there's a more refreshing voice in the city. And I think we're showcasing a collective of listeners and guest co-hosts who are not afraid to talk about things. And then so like that's what makes it. Then Jeanette was confirmed on her financial statements to use the same campaign Murphy Nasica as Governor Abbott and the Republican State Party. So yeah, things just got very murky, and I would imagine the Tara Wilson camp is very confused on what they want to do and where they would go. We can navigate those together if you guys want to, but I'm also we also have time. Where are you at, D, on this outside looking in from because again I do have a relationship with both as well in this situation.
I still have a lot of friends and family that live in District 11. I was until recently a resident of District 11. I care deeply about what happens to District 11. And I think you're going to be hard-pressed to find mainstream politicians and leadership figures in Fort Worth to talk about the POA and the CCPD, because I think everyone's afraid that they're going to dump money against them. Like, that's very real. Like, if you have a conversation with a politician about CCPD and what it would look like to reform that or dismantle that so that we have more resources to invest in things that a lot of progressives care about, whether that's housing, public transit, support for the arts, like, the CCPD fund, in my understanding, as far as the mainstream goes, is untouchable. And so I can understand why Tara would have a problem with a candidate that's backed by the POA, why I, as a voter, have a problem with a candidate that is backed by the POA as a progressive voter. Now, the real question is where does Rick stand on that, right? And I think the conflict of interest question, I'm actually really glad she brought that up. Right? Because the way that we recruit people for leadership positions as a city, right, is we look to the usual suspects, who's going to toe the line and not cause too many waves. Like, I think over and over again, we're being presented the story of Fort Worth as a moderate place, right? Like, Mayor Price has kind of stepped away from some of her conservative bona fides and has clearly positioned herself as a middle of the ground candidate. And I'm a pragmatic person. Like, do I think Jeanette will fit well into that administration, given her work history and the campaign she's run? Yeah, probably. But as a progressive, do I find that disappointing? I really do.
Yeah, I agree. I think, when you have people who are supported by similar entities, like you're going to get a certain kind of conversation, right? And the best decisions are made when you have a diversity of perspectives. Do I think the city council, if Tara had won, is the city council going to go from where it is now to like be as fully aligned with my own like political views? Like, no, but like we needed that voice in there. And it's not a secret. I mean, even Jeanette knows that I voted for Tara, so it's okay to say.
Yeah.
But, I think so for me, that was a really big loss for her to not win. And like the conversations that I was having with people around that, like even because, basically all my family lives in District 11 as well. The conversations around that was like, well, do you think that she can win? Right? Like, do I think that Tara can win? And, it's like, I think sometimes as voters, we try to like game a system that really is not like gameable. You know what I mean? It's like vote for the person that you are excited to have represent you. Like that's who you should vote for. And I don't know if other voters maybe would have been more aligned with Tara, like in terms of their politics, but maybe thought, well, she's too much unlike the Fort Worth way, so I'm going to vote for the safer person that's more likely to win. Jeanette, if I want a Latina to be representing the district. I don't know how much that factored into people's views and also who went to vote, right? Yeah. Because I would like to think that in District 11, you'd get more, more people would be aligned to Tara's political views, but I don't know. And so, I do feel like it was a loss for her to not be the person in that seat.
Yeah. No, I think what happened, the establishment did that with District 7, like, oh yeah, Macy Hill. We know how this works. It's like, oh, we enter our person, get the campaign person we use, enter. And I think they thought they could get away with doing that with a Democrat who's a tan person, but then think we were all just going to say, oh yeah, here's what we've been looking for, not knowing that no, you guys are they did this with Flores, right? And so Tara could have won if Jeanette didn't exist. I think Tara could have won. I think if Ricardo Vitia had 6%, the Chris Johnson had 6%, that's another 12. And she easily could have won. Who would have been one of the most progressive campaigns that we've had, and that stayed true to that. So I do feel excited about that piece for the progressive voice. I just think we got all sloppy on our communication. Is a part of the Tarrant Democrat County, office kind of the issue as well, of not really being more organized around who's our next horse. I mean, who's our next jockey in the race. So anyways, like I understand how difficult this is. We're talking 517 votes. You're talking 18% of the people who voted. I don't know where they're going to go. Heck, I don't know where I'm going to go. So this is a very exciting time, because I think it shows you where there is a set of progressives, and even I would argue that a lot of Rick's people were Democrats as well, that were just, he knew through the home associations. So like an older white Democrat who would have voted for like Joe Biden, and so it just shows me that this district does feel like the drama goes all the way from like center Republican, but then it's just like to like the left, and it's like we're fighting in that lane, which I think was very exciting to be doing in Fort Worth. It's where we're talking about the establishment Democrat and the progressive Democrat. That's exciting to see that there could have, there was a little race.
Yeah. Well, and I think I went to a Steer Fort Worth event recently where they do this thing called Policy and Pint, and the topic was money in elections. And I moved back in 2020, so I wasn't like very plugged in while I was away. But I didn't realize like the POA, basically they were saying at that event, somebody said that pretty much whoever they endorse like wins, right? And so my question is like, what are they doing? Like, how are they rallying their people to like make sure they're voting, right? Like, what do they feel? I mean, I guess they must be scared that abolitionism is at stake or something, right? Like that their entity is at stake, because I feel like how you know, I question that, right? That like the fact that their money is a direct correlation to like who's winning. It's like, how do we create the counter to that? Like, what's the counter, and how does it get formed?
Also, the fact that this was a Latino opportunity district specifically kind of opened itself up to like weird things happening in this election. Like, Latino voters are not a monolith. Like, I think if you look at the last national election, like Trump and Biden, like Black voters, like overwhelmingly Biden. Trump voter or Latino voters, like I think most of them broke for Biden, but not to the degree that Black voters did, right? And there's
especially in Texas.
Yeah, like there's a lot of Latinos that are in the police force and have close relationship with the police. So when they see that endorsement, it's valuable. But I think for progressives, it's definitely a loss.
Well, let's go ahead and continue to move on into the podcast. And I actually think what you were just talking about also goes into our big story. But our third story is also about, you know, it's so crazy how the police association has so much power, yet they can't find anyone to fill their seats for jobs and the needs that they have. So short story number 3 is about both Dallas County and Tarrant County jails are struggling to keep guards in their departments, and they have a lot of vacancies within their systems, both Dallas County and Tarrant County. We saw that in December 2022, Tarrant County had vacancies of 179 spots, and Dallas County struggling with more than 160 vacancies, with a quarter of their department over 55. So you also have the I guess officers that they do have also on the verge of retirement. So this is a perfect kind of segue from like, how does one thing from the community view look so powerful, but yet when you look at the fundamental blocks of them, no one wants to work there or be a part of it. What does this story say to you guys, and how are you looking at when you read this story this week?
I'm not surprised that they're having a hard time recruiting. I think if you were to ask the sheriff's department or the police department why they're having a hard time recruiting, they would say, we're not paying enough, or we don't have enough like cool new police toys. But, you know, especially in light of the stories that have come out of Tarrant County Jail, and specifically under Sheriff Wayborn's watch, like, I'm not surprised that nobody wants to work there. It sounds like a mess. Like, it sounds like it's abusive and poorly run. It's a disgrace that it's happening in Tarrant County.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I was reading the article, I was kind of like, this isn't a problem I feel like we need to solve. But then the last line, the last line was like, maybe we need to think about this differently. I think they quoted, I'm not sure if I'm saying their name right, but Amit Dominic from the president of the Texas Prisons Community Advocates Organization. And they said, because we're having such a hard time filling this, and that's a really big gap, because also in the article they highlight the fact that that gap is also a huge budget issue, because then you're having to pay people overtime. So I think at least in Dallas County, they paid like $34 million over budget due to overtime pay last year, and so it's a fiscal issue. It's also a human rights issue, like when we think about all the deaths that are happening in the jails. And so to me, I'm like, okay, why didn't we spend more time on that last line of, hey, if this is such a big problem, what if we try to solve it differently by having this not be a problem, and instead focus on what are the alternative ways to address the issue? And I feel like they only literally wrote one sentence on that in the article. So
yeah, it's weird that the only answer is like, we need more police, more staff, instead of like, how can we scale back how we're incarcerating people and why we're incarcerating people, right? Like,
exactly,
it's never
like,
an
reduce
option.
The population, then you don't have this problem, right? Instead of just like, let's put more bodies, because all of this is also very financial. Like, I mean, it's incredibly expensive, and it's so much money spent that could be spent in so much more compassionate human ways.
Yeah, I think I read a report recently that said like what we pay to incarcerate someone for life is like way more than it would be like, here's some supportive housing, right? Like, from a budget concern, but I don't think it ever really, I don't know. I have a hard time feeling optimistic about this conversation because I just don't think that they see it that way. It's really just like, well, there's so much crime, right? We're being told like there's so much crime, there's so many criminals, we're being invaded. Like, let's just make the jails bigger. Let's hire more police. And it's sad, and I don't know that will change anytime soon, unfortunately.
I like the part you said off recording, Nydia, around like, who do you like? The people who want these positions want some form of power. Like, I think that's, you saw that with the Aaron Dean situation, and with the murder of Tatiana Jefferson. Like, I think like how people like Aaron Dean then gets a gun through our counties or cities, then to make a reaction because they want to play this high intensity scene that was all perpetrated by their own creation and their racist perspective of where they were at the time. Yeah, I mean, I've always been like, I don't know if this part will go into the podcast, but I feel like, when I hear abolitionists talk about like, taking down the police force, but then I see that a police officer was on site to kill the Allen outlet shooter. How do I navigate that? Like, I think what's tough for people who say defund the police, we are abolitionists of the police, for the older audiences, they go back to, well, without police, that guy would have killed a lot more people in Allen.
No, actually, without the gun he had.
That's really
that we're okay. So if you want to talk about that, then we have to talk about both things, right? If you want to say, okay, we're keeping the police, you also have to say those people shouldn't be. Who needs a freaking like machine gun like that? I don't even know what kind. But the guns that shoot,
yeah.
I don't even. I tried to assault rifle. Thank you. Like, who needs that? Like, I don't. If you're a hunter, hey, you're a better hunter if you have a regular gun and can actually, get the animal, right? Like,
I've never seen anyone use that for hunting.
Yeah, but
like, I've been with hunters.
Yeah,
like they
what
get
do people use it for?
shotguns.
Yeah, like, right. So I think if you're gonna have that, you have to be willing to talk about both things.
Yeah, and I think that's like what I'm thinking about the lens of people who are hearing us talk, where this is very casual for us to talk about. Oh, like even your incident of just saying like, oh, well, let's just have less people out of jail. Someone on the road just now just said, well, that sounds like a bad idea. So how, like, I'm figuring out like how to us navigate, because you're right, because it's out. There's no way that police should have as much money as they have of our city budgets today. There's no way.
Specifically in Fort Worth, right?
Yeah.
Specifically Fort Worth. Like, so Houston, San Antonio, Austin, like all other comparable cities in our same region are moving along just fine without all of that money going to the police. And there's a big conversation that we can have about what public safety looks like. I think the defund the police conversation can be a little misleading because it's about investing in other ways, right? You're a business person. Like, at some point that just becomes a sinkhole and it's not working. So what else can we invest in that's going to work for us? And, in the case of who's going to come to my rescue when I need something, like, honestly, for me, it's usually friends and family. Like, I've been held at gunpoint and mugged, and it was terrifying. And then I called the police, and the police didn't do anything for me. It was my therapist. It was my friends. They never found who took my bag or where they went. I don't think I ever got a follow back call from a detective. When my car's been broken into, right? Like, you call, you file a police report, but I don't expect to get that stuff back. I think there's all kinds of things that we can imagine of like how to keep each other safe better as a community. And the fact that we like insist on doubling down and just more police, more prisons, more police, more prisons. It's a complete failure of imagination.
Say it, Dee. It's a failure of imagination. I mean, it's just so, it's like we're overinvested in a strategy that is not effective, right? It's just not. And if you look at, I mean, there's so many layers to this conversation, but I think during the pandemic, I read and to those listening, I recommend this book. It's a compilation of essays by Mariam Kambe, who's an activist, but it's called "We Do This Till We Free Us," and it's about abolitionist organizing. And when I read the book, I wouldn't say that I was like, fully in the like defund the police camp. But I was exploring like, where do I stand, right? Yeah. Like what is my relationship to this? And then I read the book and I was like, oh, okay, all right. Where do I sign up to be part of this? Because I think we're just investing in something that isn't working. And you have so many, if you look at that top, like you were saying, EJ, like the fact that, your initial reaction is like, oh, I want people who are committing crimes to be in prison, right? Like, I'll be safer that way. And it's like, okay, well, dig into what are the crimes that people are supposedly committing. Mm-hmm. And, you've got like sentences for stuff that don't make any sense, right? Like you hear about people who get caught with just like marijuana and like they're in prison for how long, right? Like it's just like they don't add up. There's so much stuff that doesn't add up, but we just keep it simple by being like, oh, it's safer this way for us. We're safe because the bad people are there. We're catching the bad people, but that's not it. That's not that's not safety,
No, I think it all makes a great point, and I think it's a conversation I'm glad we're having on the podcast. It's very hard to get on a podcast where I feel like my co-hosts are aligned on something, to have a conversation about something that I think more Fort Worthians need to have. It's been an honor to be in spaces with you and spaces and other people who talk about this topic to push the narrative, because I honestly think I usually think the thing that's separating a moderate Democrat to a progressive Democrat is this conversation. I think a lot of times they're all game with, oh yeah, social issues. But then once it comes about police, it's like you have the old school who get nervous. And I think lack of imagination, being okay to explore that imagination, is something that Fort Worth is not doing.
And I want to add, EJ, that like we have close family friends who are police officers and they are wonderful. Like, there's at least one person that comes to mind that is like a wonderful, wonderful person. And so these conversations aren't personal. I'm not saying like, get rid of all the police. I hate them. Like they're bad people. It's just that this is a solution that isn't really working well for us, right? Like if you called an exterminator and you said like, I'm being overrun by bugs, and like, okay, it's going to be like $500. And then you have to call next week and it's like, you know what? $1,000. Yeah. And now it's like $5,000. And it's like, how much am I going to have to pay you to help me solve this problem? And, everything else in my house is falling apart because I'm only focusing on this one issue this way.
Yeah.
That's all.
It's a really good metaphor.
A great sign of something that needs innovation is people who no longer want to work in your environment. I think that's a sign of change. And surely your data is showing that the way we do things with jails and our criminal justice system no longer can work. This kind of also goes into the big story.
So our big story this week actually comes from the Dallas Morning News, and I'm sorry, Fort Worth. But it comes from a couple of really excellent journalists, Imelda Garcia and Maria Ramos Pacheco. If you're not following them, follow them. They do amazing work. And it was in light of the shooting in Allen. And it says, Machismo, misogyny, misinformation, why some Hispanic people become white supremacists. A Hispanic person with far-right views is not something new, and experts say people of any background can develop extremist beliefs. So the Allen shooting, I think the name of the shooter came out, and, based on the name alone, it sounded like an Hispanic surname. And immediately on social media, you could see people asking, like, well, there's no way he could be a white supremacist because he's Hispanic. And I think even was it Elon that said something about this being like some planted story or something? It was weird. And
he says a lot of crazy stuff.
It says wild things. He says wild things. But there was a lot of confusion, I think, in communities about how can an Hispanic person be a white supremacist. And I saw those comments and I was like, where are you from? Like, where are you living? Because I identify as a person of color, of Mexican descent. So Hispanic ethnicity, I think I technically refer to myself as Latinx. And I know where I'm from that we have conversations all the time about who's brown, who's white adjacent. And it is strange to me that that's not a conversation that I see happening in my communities here, my other Latinx communities, and then beyond that. And Nidia, like I know we talked before, and you identify too as a Latina. What are your thoughts on this?
When y'all sent this article in the thread, I was like, oh, my heart sank. And I do think it is a really, really important conversation because, when you look, for me, the hard part is often like seeing people in our community vote, the ones who are voting, like sort of voting against our best interest, or like even voting for people who refer to us as rapists and killers, and all these different things. And there's a lot of sort of reasons around that. But I think in the community, it's like and I think about this too because people don't normally think I'm Mexican. They think I'm like Indian, Persian, like something else. And it's not until I like maybe say something that sounds, in Spanish, like say it like tortilla, right? Then they're like, oh wait, you said that really well. And I'm like, yeah, Spanish is my first language. And so, I recognize even for myself, like that, I'm sort of ambiguous or like white passing at times, things like that. And what I think in a lot of ways, the freedom that creates for me. And I think that there's people in our community who feel like if they don't lean into these problematic white supremacist views, then they're going to be on the out, and that's unsafe, right? People are going to assume they're going to be like, go back to where you came from, like right? And it's also so much like internalized oppression, right? Like that self-hate of like, okay, white body supremacy, right? Like that's the ideal that we should all strive for. And so many things are connected to that. And so then people come here fleeing like awful situations at times. And then they just say, hey, I want to be that. Like, I want to be the ideal. Instead of being, and you get almost like, you don't have, and I know I feel really lucky because I'm first generation. Both my parents were born in Mexico, but we also had the ability to go back like very often. And so I feel like a very strong connection to my culture and like very proud, even though I grew up in the US. But I know that also that is plays a role too, right? Like how much is your culture a part of your identity, and is it something that you feel proud about, or something that you feel like you're supposed to hide, or and that can really play into how people can become absorbed in this thing that is not our, like not for us, actually against us, but they're just trying to find a place.
Mm-hmm. So something I thought that was interesting that the article mentioned that they spoke to a few experts, right? And the experts, referred to the role of race and ethnicity in racism, the history of racism among Hispanic people dating back to the conquest, so colonialism, it's a legacy of colonialism, and then the lack of access to mental health care, and that just a confluence of different things can come together to create what happened with the shooter in Allen. And I know something that we spoke about offline too was the idea of alienation, and I think you hit it just now, right? Like being in touch with your culture, and how many of us get to participate in our culture once we're here, or once we're one or two generations down. Like how easy it is for us to find other people to connect with, find cultural expression from our communities of origin that we can tap into and support. And just the fact of the matter is that we live in a place where public resources are really underfunded. So access to mental health care or counseling is always going to be a barrier if you're marginalized or alienated.
What are your guys' pulling it kind of back from not talking about the far right views, just views of the right is common for Hispanic households and I think a common topic right now among Democrats is how do we connect to the Latinx vote, which they saw starting to lose in Texas, places where Obama won by 20 points, Trump came and took from Biden. We have a podcast of 3 Latinxers in the building, right? So what if we were being talked to by the Tarrant Democratic Party about how do we engage the Latin community to understand what we stand for? What would be y'all's take here?
I think part of the issue with that question is that we're not a monolith. Like Latinx is like a big flattening term, and whether you're of Mexican descent, and even in Mexico, that can look really different. So today I had this really great meeting with a gentleman who runs like a lucha libre events like all over the country. It was super cool. And he was telling me like he's from Mexico City and it's really niche, and he hangs out with like a lot of the counterculture people. And that's going to look really different from, someone that's from another state in Mexico that might be more rural, more conservative. And that's just Mexico. Like once you bring in other people of different backgrounds into the mix, it's totally different. So I think the first thing that I would advise them to do is like understand what those differences are before you come talk to people, right? I will say that like one thing that unites a lot of Latinos or Latinxes, Latines, right? Even what we prefer to call ourselves is just runs the gamut depending on who you're talking to. Is that we're just like everyone else. Like we have different things that motivate us and that we care about. Like understand that first before you come courting for votes, and not just assume that, oh, well, they're brown, they're Latino, right? They have an Hispanic surname that's in the bag, because it's not.
I'm only going to speak to my extended family in the sense that I think it represents like the different issues that, or the different reasons why people would vote a certain way. And one conversation is definitely like on the religious front, right? And honestly, to be fair, like to your question about the Democratic Party, it's also like, well, all they do is promise things. It feels like that's what happens. Like there's a lot of promises and not always follow through, right? So then, to some degree, one way to court us is to show me the evidence. But the other thing is, I think religion plays an important role a lot of the time, and I know that people tend to be, often, especially, most familiar with Catholicism, might be single issue voters, where they really focused on pro-life and they feel like they need to be that vote. And what I think is really important, honestly, I used to be one of those people. And I think what I recognize is like, wait a second, if I'm speaking for the unborn, what do I think they want me to say? Like, do they want me to say like, but especially with the 2020 election, it was just like, come on, there's clearly a candidate that's claiming to be pro-life that is not, and so it's like, well, what kind of world do those babies want to be born into? Like, do they want to be born into a world where, their parents are going to be working 4 jobs because they have to in order to pay for food and housing? Like, do they want to have access to healthcare? Do I want my mom to potentially like die because I'm born because she didn't get to go to the doctor, didn't have good health, right? Like there's all these different things, and I just feel like people, I think if they connect back to like, oh, what I care about is like, being pro-life, it's like, okay, well, message around that, but what does it look like to really be truly pro-life, and not just, in the sense of like policy, right? Or just like about abortion. And so, or like just wanting to reduce unwanted pregnancies. Okay, let's do that. How do we do that then, And I just think that it's often for our community, a lot of the thing is like around immigration is like the topic that they always want to come to us about.
That's the only thing that we care about. Yeah. Exactly. We care about our families. Like I said, we're just like any other voter. And I really love that you said that it's a lot of broken promises, right? Like it is, it sometimes in this country, especially like as a first generation person, it feels like, you're kind of taken for granted or overlooked, like even during the pandemic, right? When they were like, okay, just frontline workers. They're the only ones that have to check in. And it's like, well, what do your frontline workers look like? How are you looking out for them? You know, there was so much loss of life in the Brown and Hispanic community during the pandemic. Like, that's something that, well, you know, they bear the brunt of that. When it comes to like immigration reform, like, well, where is the immigration reform, right? Other things that we care about, like you ask most like friends of my mom that are her age and what they care about education, and they want to make sure that like their kids get a fair shake. And that's increasingly hard to do with like so many resources being pulled out of school or even like public school funding.
Or they care about jobs, like being able to work, you know, the economy, like how, you know, some of my cousins were just like, oh, life's been pretty good while Trump's been in office, like economically for me. So why would I change that, right? And like that's what they're using to make a decision.
So I think a part of it too is this could be just being how I'm talking in my narrative about it, but it also seems like we're very young Americans. The average Latinx American is 11. The average Black American is 28. The average white American is 58. Right? If you ask me to name a Black politician or anyone with a mic, hey, name a Black politician, then go Kamala Harris, Obama, Stacey Abrams, John Lewis. Name a Hispanic politician. I think the only name you're going to get is AOC. Like
Ted Cruz and Marco Rubio.
Yeah, but they won't. Yeah, exactly. Right. Yeah. But even them, even them do a good job for everyone to forget that they are Hispanic. So it's like, I also feel like, I don't know. I feel like there's this wave it's coming, and going back to the first, like the previous story with Tara, like I think she was an example of that. It's coming, like that number who votes for Tara in a situation like that is only going up and to the right. So that's kind of my hope to it all, is that we're all still very young.
I do too. And I also hope that, you know, the ones that are older, like I'm a geriatric millennial apparently, the ones that are older, that we do a better job of like talking to the young people in our communities about the legacy of colonialism and what that looks like for us, right? I think that article did a good job of pointing out that a lot of this is what we get like from when Spain colonized the Americas, right? Like the classification of like whites at the top, and then, you know, it goes down from there. And to start dismantling that and to create more avenues to participate in like a rich cultural life that celebrates the real diversity in Latin American heritage.
And the pride, yeah, like, I mean, Cinto Ramos and Ricky Clark are mentors of mine, and, you know, they always say, like, you can't love the fruit unless you love the root. And if you're not, you know, proud, if you haven't had the opportunity to like learn about your culture, feel pride in that. Because I think the article talked about how the Allen shooter, I think his dad is like half Mexican, and then he also himself, like, kind of in his posts would say he was ashamed of having any of that like in his heritage, and so clearly, like, he didn't identify as Latino at all, right? Like, he had no pride in that, and so I think when people feel pride in their own culture and can see that other people should be welcome to feel pride in their culture too, like, it's not about, if I'm proud, you can't be proud because then my culture's bad. It's not that. It's like, hey, we all have these different experiences and we can be proud of them. Then I think you can. There's a different way you show up in the world, I think, when you have that.
Yeah, another part of this where I wish the story would have went into is also just like the challenges of being like male masculinity, especially in all cultures, but, you know, the machismo-ness in a, you know, more Mexican culture. Like, I feel like that is really something that I think doesn't get discussed enough. And I think as something I navigate throughout all of this is just thinking through like the data of where it's going, where, you know, back in the day, I mean, 100 years ago, the guy had to be the protector, so he had to make the family feel safe. He was often the smartest person because he was the only one allowed to go to school, and he was the provider, and, you know, because he was the one going out and making money. And now you're looking at that flipping, and so you're seeing that, you know, for every one male who graduates college, 2 women are graduating college, right? You're seeing that 70% of high school valedictorians are women. You're seeing that.
Woo woo.
Yeah, exactly. All these are good. Again, I think all of these are good things, but I think there is not enough dialogue among men and community among men, because a lot of this is also loneliness and looking for community. So you then go to YouTube. Men are more likely to watch alt genre news sources than women as well. So it's like, I think there's this, I don't know, there's the masculinity piece too that underbellies all of this, right? 98% of incidents like happening, Alan, is done by a male. So I don't know. I think that's another part of this, that we need to create more spaces, community support, to navigating what does masculinity look like in a more equitable world where, you know, colonialism had it where it was also a lot of masculine dominance, and our founding fathers and all this stuff. Like, I understand that I think, you know, the Hispanic male is probably in the priority of who needs representation when we talk. They don't see themselves in a lot of the dialogues because a lot of people go up before them, because those people do need voices. So I think, like, how do we assist on the new chapter of what's a new man look like in a more equitable world needs to happen for these guys, because that's a lot of what I see of this, like, hopelessness, you know, lack of economic mobility, lack of education, lack of independence, lack of feeling ownership, lack of feeling, you know, I guess whatever quote unquote a man means today to a lot of these guys. So, like, this disruption and need to be heard is a lash out that shouldn't have to happen.
Mm-hmm. How do we make space for them as the world changes? I agree. And you're right. Like, I have a lot of communities that participate on Facebook, like Mexican women in Dallas, like Mexican women in Fort Worth, and we'll, like, go play loteria, or, you know,
Yeah.
I think there were, like, some seminars on, like, female empowerment, and it's really fun. But again, it's like all women. And it's like, well, what are the men doing? And I see it in my household too, right? Like, all the aunties would get together and, like, I guess you guys just watch your soccer, like, we're out.
Yeah.
And so I wonder, like, what spaces are there for men, and how are we pulling them into that conversation so that it's not so lonely, right?
I think this connects back to, I think, the thread of imagination that you brought up earlier. It's that I want to believe that we are in a time of change and evolution, like, that we're going to come out of this, even though I think it's going to be ugly and a lot of people are going to be lost in the process. Like, I do think we're going to be in a new context. And so we do have to be able to imagine, what does it look like, right? To be like because we all have both masculine and feminine energy. Because I think it's also both, like, how it doesn't feel, if men, you know, doesn't feel safe for women to be in their feminine energy when there's all this toxic masculine energy, like, in the world. But yet we need feminine energy. Like, the polarity of those two is, like, what creates balance, right?
Yeah.
But we just are so hyper masculinized, like, as a society, you know, or have been. And so I think it's important to just offer up, like, hey, I appreciate you bringing this topic up, because I can't, it's not the same for me to bring it up, right? It's like amongst men, okay, how about you guys, you know, model this, like, experiment. What does it look like to do, to bring, like, that healthy masculine energy, like, into the world, because it is needed. I'm not saying, you know, by men, right? Like, no, that's not what I'm saying. I'm saying the healthy, you know, masculine energy, the one that's about, like, care and, you know, problem solving and organizing and structure, not the one that's about, because, like, or like toxic, suppressed, really it's actually, like, the bad form of masculine energy is, like, the one that's, like, competitive, the one that's, like, about domination and power, and that's the form we've seen. So I think we're even saying, like, that is what a man equals, but no, that's what a toxic man equaled. So what about, and I think we all have men who operate in a healthy masculine energy, probably examples, like, in our lives, sometimes not that many, but you know, and so being able to use those as models, I think, is important.
Yeah. Well, we talked about a lot of things on this podcast, beautiful people. We started out with Tim O'Hare and the election situation that we are, and we might be moving back to paper, and there actually will be no internet, and so you're going to get this podcast from a carrier pigeon. We talked about District 11 and the nuances of politics in Fort Worth, where a progressive can endorse a Republican. We then went and dived into why do no one want to be working in jails in our counties, both Dallas and Tarrant. Then we dived into the nuances of the last couple stories of Texas, of shootings in Texas, have been led by Hispanic descent men of some capacity who might have some ties or beliefs to far right wing groups. So let's move into wins and losses, where I think we'll have a lot of celebration. I want to kudos both Dee and Nydia for having a really tough conversation on the podcast. I wish you guys come back, and it's usually fun. I just think I think it's rare to have, to be honest with you guys, last week we had Leah King. The week before that, Pamela Young was intimidating for me as well. And then the week before that, Ann Zeta was also very intimidating. But I was very intimidated for this one most, and simply because how far we could go. Mm. That was ultimately why. I knew that I won't be able to do that with those who I talked to, which we did go far. I'm not saying that's the case, but I was really excited to just be a fly on the wall and see how far we go today. And I think we talked about a lot of stuff, and I know the pod community will appreciate it. Let's dive into wins and losses. Who wants to share their loss first? I guess actually, Dee, go ahead and first, because yours is like a combo win-loss for one big topic.
I'm going to do a win-loss for one big topic. So arts in Fort Worth. So the Community Arts Center in Fort Worth has been home to local artists for a long time. It was originally the Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, but when the Modern Art Museum built their new building, they left the Community Arts Center behind. It's been in need of serious repairs. It's been very neglected. And so now there is a task force that is going to decide what's going to happen with that space. So my loss is that I feel like we continue to undervalue and undersupport and under-resource arts in Fort Worth, but I am hopeful to see some organizing around that. I don't know if any of you knew Wesley Kirk. He's an amazing human being, and he started a new initiative to support Fort Worth art. There's one more meeting happening on this issue. So I recommend you keep your ears open and show up and advocate for local artists.
I love it.
That's awesome. Yes. Art is really important to all communities. So I'll do my loss first, so then I'm going to do my win. So the loss I had was an article about, it was called The World of Hurt. I think it was in the Fort Worth Report, I want to say. But it was in the Fort Worth Report. And it just talked about the statistics. And I've seen a lot of headlines around this of like young people, especially young women or youth that identify as LGBTQ, feeling in extreme like depression, suffering from lots of mental health challenges. And I think I recommend this. Like, I encourage people to read that article and to watch the video that's in that article. It was an ad that the Dove campaign ad around the impact of social media on women. But I just feel like it's such a loss for so many young people to feel so unwelcomed in who they are, like in our world. And I just think that if we can shift that, like, that would be such a powerful thing to like bring young people, instead of investigating bars that are having trans events. They could instead be figuring out how do we help young people feel welcomed and loved and supported. So that's my loss, that we're not there, and so that's that. And then on my win side, this was also from a Dallas article, but I want to shout out Impact Ventures, which is an organization in Dallas that is focused on accelerating and investing in all shades of genius. So they have an accelerator and an investment fund, but they organized the inaugural Inclusive Capital Summit May 5th and 6th in Dallas. And I went to that event, and it was just really great. I mean, to have that conversation around how do we, the stats for people who aren't as familiar with like the entrepreneurship space, women and Black, Latino, Indigenous founders do not have the same access to capital that white founders do. And so the summit was really focused on supporting entrepreneurs, also people who want to invest, and then also people who create the ecosystem around those. And so, yeah, just want to celebrate that that's happening in this area, and hope that more Fort Worth people want to have that conversation about how do we build these new economic systems that are more inclusive. So that's my win.
Awesome. Well, there you go. We have completed another episode of the 817 podcast. I think we're going to break an hour on this one. I haven't edited it, so we will see. But if we do, that's okay. You guys could split it up in two because we will not be doing an episode next week. So there you have it.
Good suggestion.
And then June 4th, we will have our first committed co-host for the 817 podcast, post Jimmy. That will be Jimmy's last episode. So June 4th will be a good time. And then we'll announce our first committed co-host. A lot's run into my mind. We've had a lot of great pod. Some of you have said so many great things about everyone who's come on. I want to do something special. Got to figure it out. Maybe we'll build like a Avengers or something podcast where everyone somehow stays involved. But it's been really cool to do this journey with you guys. And thank you for tying a bow on top of it and just sharing your guys' story and representing the things you do.
Thanks.
You, Jay.
This is fun. Yeah.
Dopamine swipe, follow us, likes, double tap. Now they control your life, control your life. Dopamine swipe, dopamine swipe.